This is The Golden Rule with David Fischer. For the latest information about bail-ins, bailouts, the economic collapse, and much more, go to landmarkgold.com.
Well, welcome to The Golden Rule. This is podcast number 43. I'm David Fischer, the CEO of Landmark Capital. So I want to talk on what happened. There's multiple things that happened when Steve Mnuchin spoke before the Senate Banking Committee on May 18th. We talked previously about that in reference to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Now I want to talk about and I said, will the real Steve Mnuchin stand up? Now I want to talk about another topic that was brought up before Congress, and that is Glass-Steagall. Let's take a walk down memory lane again. We had a 1929 crash, didn't we? Why did we have that? Well, banks were operating not only in the commercial side, lending out money, but they were also operating in the investment side, leveraging money and loaning out money to people who wanted to buy stocks. And they also went in the market themselves. Did what you call investment banking. When loans were called back in and there was the start of this process, there was a massive pullout by Wall Street, which had a significant amount of money in the market at the time. And this caused the crash of 1929, all because there was not a separation between commercial and investment banking. So as a result of that, there was a U.S. Banking Act of 1933 that was called the Glass-Steagall Act. So here we are involved in a few years after this, a few years after the crash. Actually, it was 1932 they created Glass-Steagall. And this was the law that separated banks requiring to choose which side of the fence they're going to be on, either the commercial side, lending money to individuals, businesses, and corporations, or being in the security banking or investment banking. So they separated that, and that as such where you created brokerage companies since then, and you created banks that lent out money. So they chose, there was a fork in the road in 1932. This went on for quite some time until President Clinton had a great idea. In 1999, he went before Congress and he actually signed legislation reversing all of this. He, in essence, said, this is outdated. We don't need this anymore. So President Clinton now allowed this to be merged. In fact, he declared the Glass-Steagall law is no longer appropriate, quote unquote. This allowed banks to do the same behavior, what they did prior to 1929, merge themselves into a dual focus, having commercial banking and also investment banking. So if you think back then, this is when some banks started to have a security division where they said, oh, you have a loan? How about a retirement? Have you thought about that? We also manage those. So that's when this all started as a result of President Clinton. We fast forward to pre-2008, a little bit before that, and let's put this all into perspective. Banks were leveraging money called derivatives. They bought mortgage-backed securities also. They were upside down in many of their positions, and when one got in trouble, it was the domino effect. Bear Stearns went under, which caused Lehman to be in trouble. Lehman was not bailed out, and then it looked like they were going to, then they didn't. It snowballed into the brokerage industry. And if you remember, Bank of America was forced to buy Merrill Lynch, which is in trouble. This was the government forcing this. And the government forced money into the banking system through requiring Wall Street and banks to shore up and buy treasuries. And this is what put the temporary Band-Aid on the environment in 2008. And then they passed a law called the Dodd-Frank Act, which part of that law had what you call the Volcker Rule. And it was originally proposed to stop, first of all, Volcker Rule is Paul Volcker, who's the chairman of the Federal Reserve previously. And he was a person that believed that they should have never lifted the Glass-Steagall So they put a Volcker rule in place, in essence, saying, let's bring back Glass-Steagall. The law was passed, yet there's a difference between passing a law and implementing a law. They never implemented the Volcker rule. So banks still were allowed to this day to leverage money, to be on the investment side and be on the commercial side. That's the backdrop. So when Steve Mnuchin, who's a Goldman Sachs guy, he's also ran a bank that foreclosed on thousands of people, so he understands the banking industry. But he comes from Wall Street, so he's done both sides of this. Previously, he has said that he was all in favor of Glass-Steagall, which means they should separate the two entities, either become a bank or become an investment firm. Don't do both. This would cause breaking up the banks. Well, before the House and Senate committee last week on May 18th, he was asked the question if he was in support of that. He said yes. This is by Senator Elizabeth Warren. Now, a side note, I don't care for a lot of the things Senator Elizabeth Warren does or says. Prior to Senator Elizabeth Warren asking Steve Mnuchin, there was another congressman asking Steve Mnuchin to list to the committee, send the committee a list of all the banks he's been meeting with and when he met with them and what they talked about. He was asked that before. He did not provide that. Wonder why. He was asked again and he said, yes, I'll provide that. And he asked the committee to have that information not become public. Now, why did he say that? Let's put the pieces of the puzzle together. So we fast forward. Within the hour, Senator Elizabeth Warren is asking him about Glass-Steagall, who he was in support of at one point before May 18th. And on May 18th, he was asked the question. He says, yes, I'm in support of that, but ask a little more detail. He is not in favor of the separation of a bank becoming either an investment bank or a commercial bank. Ask multiple times, what is Glass-Steagall? Or even the bill that Elizabeth Warren put through 3 years ago, trying to be and redid it in a bipartisan way earlier this year, called the 21st Century Glass-Steagall Act of 2017, who she's the lead sponsor on this. Steve Mnuchin didn't even know about it, which you would think he would, which supports the breaking up of banks. Because if a bank is doing both sides, it has to break up. It's a common sense thing, obviously. Steve Mnuchin says we don't support the breaking up of big banks. I'm shaking my head. Being questioned further, asked what it was, and he said it wasn't what we're describing. Yet, if you do your research, it is that. I'm confused, as much as Elizabeth Warren is. In fact, many news agencies are saying this is bizarre. The response from Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary. Elizabeth Warren says it's something like straight out of George Orwell. Sounds a little bit of scientific here and not realistic. So I'm going to ask again, just like I asked when he talked out of both sides of his mouth with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. When he said with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they should not have to pay the Treasury any more money. They paid it all already. But a week earlier, he said behind the scenes that he wanted to continue to receive the Treasury payments from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, specifically speaking with Mel Watts. And he said this back then, a week earlier. As I said on the previous podcast, I'm going to say it again. Will the real Steve Mnuchin please stand up? You're sounding more like a politician, Steve. Americans are sick of that. What this does tell us, though, is it tells us more than that, too. It says, until they make a decision and stand by it and not change their mind and waver, we're going to have another banking crisis. We're going to have another 2008. We're going to have another 1929. That's what this tells us until our country says banks are not allowed to leverage money that will bring down the system. We're going to have another 1929, another 2008. I'm not a doomsdayer, but this is the behavior that has caused this. Let's look at the largest bank in Europe, who also has entities in America. Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank emits from 2004 to 2015, 90% of their revenue, 90% of their revenue came from this behavior. Are banks going to stop that and make only 10% of their revenue by being a bank? Could it be this is why Steve Mnuchin said before he came to this meeting on May 18th that he was in favor of Glass-Steagall and breaking up the banks, or in essence, that's what it would do. It would break up the banks if he's in favor of it. But then there were these meetings that went behind the scenes with him and President Trump. I'm not against President Trump on this, but I'm against talking out of both sides of the mouth. And when they met with big banks, that maybe, just maybe, possibility they were influenced by these big banks not wanting to break up by separating commercial banking from investment banking. And this is why, my friends, Steve Mnuchin has changed his tune again. I will say the real Steve Mnuchin who should stand up is the politician, Steve Mnuchin, because this is what politicians unfortunately do. I thought we were going to get business people in the White House. I thought we were going to get business people in the cabinet. I thought we were going to get business people taking care of business, but we're still seeing politicians doing this. I'm normally not hard on people like this, but this is the part of a financial matter that caused two of the largest crashes in the history of the world in our country that affected the whole world. This is why it's imperative until they fix the system and cause this to be stopped. Diversify and buy some gold, because the crash, it's not a matter of if will it happen again, it's a matter of when it will happen, because this is the behavior that led up to the crash. That this is the fuel, this is the engine, this is the rocket ship that caused the crash. My dear friends, get some medals. You can call my company and learn more about this from any of my representatives at 877-448-2646. Or go to landmarkgold.com. You can request an information packet. There's no pressure working with us. We're here to help you, and we've helped thousands of people. I'll say this, especially if you have an IRA 401k, you can roll over your IRA 401k into physical precious metals and take possession of them. And if you've already done that, you need to ask yourself the question, were you given what you call the 3 columns? You're probably saying, what is the 3 columns? Well, just the fact that you don't know what the 3 columns are should tell yourself and should be the concerning factor that said you should call my company and learn about the 3 columns. The 3 columns will help you learn more about precious metals than 95% of the other people out there who have already probably bought that have never been told about the 3 columns. If you bought metals and you've never heard about the 3 columns, you need to call my company and ask one of the senior representatives take you through the 3 columns. 877-448-2646. It will tell you if you hit the bullseye or not. It will tell you if your money is safe or not. It will tell you if you matched the market up to your goals. It will actually help you if you've not had goals and what you should have bought. It will help you define your goals. So again, you can call them, my company, Landmark Capital, or you can go to the website, landmarkgold.com. Again, the number 877-448-2646. Until then, this is David Fischer, CEO of Landmark Capital, speaking on podcast number 43, The Golden Rule. Have a great day.
This has been another installment of The Golden Rule with David Fischer. To stay up to date and find out the latest information, go to landmarkgold.com.